than your currency. Splurging millions, buying houses like Monopoly. Fucking 9 to 5, man, the money is.
Hey guys and girls, welcome to this week's episode of the No BS with Birchy podcast. I'm your host Nathan Birch, and this is a show unraveling the truth to the facade of the 21st century. We're now exiting the matrix and waking up to motherfucking reality. Reality doesn't seem too good for a lot of people out there. But reality doesn't seem too great. And I don't mean to start it off as a doom and gloom, right? But you know, a lot of people say it's hard to buy a property. It's hard to get into the market. It's hard to get started with property. It's hard to buy a place to live in. An average price in Sydney, for example, is $1 million. I've seen articles, for example, even in like coastal towns, like people used to be like 400 grand, 500 grand houses. Now they're like $2 million just for a shitty old shack somewhere on the coastline. And a lot of people are sitting there looking now, and they'll be sitting there going, "Fuck, my options are very, very short. I don't have the ability to buy a house. It's done. I can't. The dream is dead." And I actually think the Aussie dream, and this is a bit of a cliche sort of comment, but people say it's the dream. You know, you have to be asleep to be living the life you want to be, right? You have to be asleep. That's why it's only a dream. Everyone's dream, people go, "I want to own a house to live in." Owning a house to live in is one thing, but having a mortgage for a house with no eaves on 300 square metre block of land for $1.5 million and having to go to work for the next 30 years to go and pay that isn't really a dream. It feels more like a nightmare. So, how can you live the dream? How can you live life on your terms? How can you get it all? And, what's the best way around it? And today I want to talk about something that a lot of you will probably be aware of, but a lot of you may not have thought about this as a term. And I encourage you all to share it with your friends and family if they're trying to get into a property. If you heard them say, "Hey, I can't get into a property. It's very difficult to buy one. It's too expensive. I can't, the ship has sailed," whatever, to share this to them, because I might be able to give them some hope and some knowledge and insight to be able to get into the house that they want to live in. So what is rent vesting? Rent vesting is to, in essence, rent where you want to live and invest where you can afford to invest into. A lot of people will sit there and say, "Well, I can't buy my house for $1 million. I've got to save up a little bit more." And they'll spend another 2 years saving up some money. By the time they save up another 50,000, 100,000, whatever it takes for them to save up whatever they need to do, the property's gone up by another $500,000. And that is where people fall into the trap. It's important to, I was going to say the word be invested, right? It's important to be invested in the market that you're in. So if you're wanting to get in the property market, make sure that you have exposure to the property market. So just because you can't, like as a 17-year-old buy my first car, or 16-year-old when I bought my first car, I didn't even know what a Lamborghini was. I thought BMW was cool, whatever, right? But as a kid, I would have been like, the Lamborghini is my favorite car. But I've got to understand, I only had $500 in the account. I had more, but just, for example, $500 isn't going to go buy a Lamborghini. So it's important to work out what's realistic and work out how to go and acquire what you want. So people think they can't go do something, but the reality of it is that, I'm just here, I always say my beach house, but there's a whole row of houses where even little fibro shacks sell for $4 million a piece. And there's houses there for $6 million, houses there for $8 million. And I often think to myself, what do these people do to be able to afford an $8 million house, right? Some of them have utes in the front of them. Like, you look like a tradie. They're very nice utes, by the way. But it's like, who are these people? What do they do? And the reality is that they are people that have got skeletons and blood and flesh and all that stuff. They're just people, right? They're like all of us. We're all the same. We're all people. But how did they get that house? How did they get that property? Is it wealth? Is it intergeneration? Is it inheritance? Are they just lucky to win the lotto? But you see these places all around the country. If you go, "I haven't got a house," well, how did everyone else get one? And everyone else has always faced adversity at some point, right? So just because the housing market's very hot and the price is very high doesn't mean that you can't get one. It's like, how do you get it? What steps do you need to do in order to be able to get that? I remember this year is 2022, so my first property was in 2003. So it's 19 years this year since I bought my first property. And, there's been lots of properties I bought over the years, hundreds of them for myself. And, my first property was a property for 260. I forget how much it is. I think it was like 264,000. I've got a mind blank on how much I paid for my first property. I know it was 248 is the actual figure that's put down, but the initial price was like 265,000, something like that. Had some termites and I got a reduction. I'm pretty sure it was 265, and I got a reduction down to 248,000. And this was a little shitty house. It's a five-borough house in Western Sydney. It was in a private estate of a housing commission area in Western Sydney. And I bought this thing, and it was by no means, like, I'd never been to this suburb, never even heard of this suburb. A lot of people think Nathan grew up in Mount Druitt. The media like to say that I grew up in Mount Druitt. I actually bought my properties in Mount Druitt, but I'd never been to Mount Druitt. I lived on another area of Sydney. And I went there and I was like, this is crap. Like, who'd want to live in this, whatever. And this thing, like, the roof actually caved in because they had termites in it. That's how bad the house was. But by no means was that the house that I could ever picture myself buying, but it was just what I could afford with the money that I had at the time. That house now that I bought for 248, probably worth about $1 million. I sold it going back maybe 8 years ago. I used the profit from that house to buy my first house to live in. I just did it for a laugh, really. I sold it and I said, I'll take that money, I'll use it as a deposit for my principal place of residence. So that property performed a task as a vehicle to get me to where I wanted to be. So that property, 248,000 is the specific purchase price that I paid. The rent on it probably gets about like $600-700 a week. If I still own that property, say a 200 grand loan at 3% interest rate, it'll be $6 grand a year in interest. Rent of say 30 grand a year, 40 grand a year. Actually, no, we get 40 grand, 45 grand a year income on it now. So it'll be positive like 40 grand a year. If I still own that property, I could take that 40 grand profit after all expenses and then use that to pay rent for the house that I want to live in. Ultimately, I could then go and sell the property, take the profit, use that to go buy a house to live in, which is what I did with that one. But yeah, I look at people's portfolios all the time and they say, I want to go and buy a house for $1 million. I want to buy a house for $2 million. The question I always ask is, well, let's go do it. And they're like, well, I can't afford it. It's like, okay, well, what do you need to do to afford it? And they're like, I need to save up another 200,000. Okay, well, how are we going to save that 200,000? Oh, well, I'm just going to work really hard. Well, by the time you work hard to save that 200 grand, the property's gone up by another $1 million. You've got to save another $100,000. That's why you're never going to get it. But pushing yourself and having a plan and a strategy in order to get it is the crucial part. So I see people all the time and they go, well, you know, I've only got 100 grand. What can I do? Well, for 100 grand, you could go buy 2 properties for 200 grand a piece. They still exist in this country, and I'm talking capital cities. I bought a property for someone today in Perth, right? In Perth, in the city. It's a metro property. I bought it for $135,000 for a 2-bedroom unit in Perth. I pick up properties in Brisbane still, $190,000 for a 2-bedroom villa, townhouse. Is it the best thing someone could buy and the thing they aspire to live in? No, but it's a starting point. But let's assume that you spend 400 grand, go buy yourself 2 properties, and these things rent for 200 grand purchase, rent for $300 a week. You've now spent 400 grand, you put 100 grand down, you've got 300 grand debt, right? 300 grand debt, owning 2 properties for 400 grand in total. What has happened? You've got $300 a week times 2, which is $600 a week rent coming through. You've now got $600 a week, which is 30 grand a year. Your profit loss statement shows that you've got a value of $400,000 worth of asset, $300,000 worth of debt, $100,000 worth of net worth position, and a cash flow stream of $30,000 per year. If you're on 60 grand a year or 100 grand a year, your income's now gone up by 30 grand a year. Now, if you were to go back, pull out some equity from those properties, you go buy another 2. So you go from 400 grand worth of asset to 800 grand worth of asset. And then you've got from $600 a week rent, you've now got $1,200 a week worth of rent. Repeat the process again. You go from 4 properties worth 800 grand to 8 properties worth $1.6 million. You've used equity, you've used cash, you've got whatever. Let's assume that you've got debt on the whole amount. If the market was to double and you've got 8 properties worth 200 grand a piece, that's $1.6 million worth of asset. If that property just goes up by 10% this year, right? We're always seeing property prices go up, but if you're buying them so well cheap that they are below rebuild costs, they're below market value, you can't build the thing for that, you've got positive cash flow coming through, the risk is being removed. The chance of them going down is negligible because you can't even build it for $150,000, $200,000. So if these properties go up just by 10%, you've got $1.6 million worth of property. How much is that? There's $160,000 worth of sort of net worth that you've had increase. If they go up by 10% this year and 10% next year and 10% the year after, and whatever the case may be after that, you could have, 160 grand increase, you could have 320 grand increase. Your net worth is going up. You have a position of properties there that you can then go and take that equity out. You can either sell off a property, and like I did in my position, I sold off my first property. I remember moving into my first principal place of residence ever. I think it was about 2013. It rings a bell. I think I was 28 years old. So it's almost 10 years ago. It's 9 years ago. I bought my first principal place of residence. And I remember unboxing these videos and always unboxing these newspapers. And for those of you that are new around here, I used to be pin-up boy in the media. They used to be, oh, look at this guy, he's a bogan, he's bought some properties, whatever. It's funny how they use agendas for certain things, but it's a different topic. But I'd always keep these news articles, one, because I'd reflect back on myself and think how youthful I was in the future. And two, just so when I have kids, I'd be able to say, hey, look, your dad wasn't some old boring bastard. He was, cool before, and he was in the newspaper. And I remember looking at these newspapers, and there's boxes of them. And I looked at them, and I was like, says this guy here has 150 properties or 120 properties. There was one was on the front page, and they go, this guy's the Donald Trump of Australia. That's obviously before everyone hated him and all that sort of stuff. But it was pretty funny. And I looked at it, and I thought to myself, shit, I've got 150 properties, and I'm moving into my first property that I've ever bought to live in. And at that time, I had a laugh. I thought to myself, wow, is that a bit of like, am I a faker because I'm moving to my first house? But I was always open about it. Like, I never owned a house beforehand. And that's because I rent vested. But I realized there was a point where I was like, hang on a second, I need to get in my principal place. And that was the right time. And I remember at the time, my house that I lived in, I still own it. It's worth probably about $5 million now. I don't live there, I live somewhere else. I bought it for 1.19 million, so 1.2 million. I got a loan of 80%, which was like 960 grand. I think I owe about 800 grand on this thing now. I don't even touch it, like just pays itself down. It rents out for like $1,200 a week, something like that. But at the time, I thought to myself, and I thought, shit, I'm 28 years old. I'm paying $1.2 million, the biggest property I'd ever bought at that period of time. How am I going to afford it? So firstly, I sold my first house, paid out the loan, took the cash, say 250, 300 grand, used it as a deposit for this property. So I used that first property to sacrifice to get there. And then I thought about it. I was like, if I can't afford the $1,000 a week, I'm going to have to move out and then I have to rent it. Would it get $1,000 a week? And I was like, I might get 700, 800. And I was a bit scared, and I thought about it, right? This is what I always do. I always think about the strategy, think about how I can get to where I want to be. And I was like, hang on a second, I'm going to go put some of my rents up. And I went and emailed some of my property managers and my staff and said, hey, I need to put some rents up. And I just went through them. And I put up about 30 rents on my property. So I went to 30 of my properties, and I put the rent up by about 20 to $30 each. And I remember at the time, I was like, fuck, that was like $600-700 a week extra cash flow, right? Why didn't I do this beforehand? And it's like, well, because I was forced to reconsider. And then I was like, hang on a second, I can use these properties. So I utilized my property portfolio. Out of 150 properties, I push up rent on, say, 30 of them just by $20. Very simple thing. Whose rent doesn't move up by $20 here and there? So I put 30 rents up by $20 at $600-700 a week, extra rental income coming through. I was like, all of my tenants just paid for my house to live in. So I felt very good about myself, and it was pretty cool. But if I didn't have that property portfolio, then I wouldn't have been able to have the 30 rents go up. So in essence, I've bought the asset in order to get cash flow in order to support my lifestyle. And I don't do anything for myself personally unless it's my assets that are paying for it. So I want to have clarity, from how I'm going to be able to enjoy it. So looking at, rent vesting, how can that help someone? Well, it's not a matter of going out there and buying your big dream house today, because no one ends up in the dream home. Like, I speak to people so often and they have a misconception like rent money is dead money and all these sort of things. I look at people and they say those things and they go, I must buy a place to live in. I ask them, like, if you push yourself to all extents, right? You go push yourself and you go buy a house today, you get yourself into $2 million worth of debt, $1 million worth of debt, 500 grand. Let's say that all you can afford is a 500 grand property, and you go and buy that to live in. The question I ask is this your dream forever home? Right? Is it your dream forever home? If it's not your dream forever home, well then why are you buying it for to live in? Oh, because I don't want to pay rent. Well, hang on a second. Let's go back a step. If you had those two properties for 200 grand a piece, the rent for 300 bucks a week, you've invested 400 grand, you got yourself 600 bucks a week rent. If you're paying 500 bucks a week and you've had to go invest 600, 700, 800 grand into buying that property, and you're saving yourself $500, Paul's sort of mindset will say, well, that's a good decision. Well, reality, let's just use some numbers here. 800 grand purchase price, rents for 800 bucks a week, right? You can hardly afford it, right? If you go buy that property, you're on the hook for that mortgage. If you don't go to work tomorrow, you've got to pay that mortgage. You're attached to it. If you, for the same $800,000, go buy yourself 4 properties at $200,000 a piece, that means you've got 800 grand worth of asset. You've got 800 grand in one house, you've got 800 grand in 4 properties that are going up. You're saving yourself 800 bucks a week rent over here. But if you bought these 4 properties and they rent for 300 bucks a week each, that means that you've got 1,200 bucks a week income coming through on an 800 grand purchase, or you've got one 800 grand purchase saving yourself 800 bucks a week. What I would prefer to do is buy this portfolio of buying the 4 properties, take that extra 400 bucks per week and utilize that to pay for the cash, to pay for the rent, until you build up that asset base. Then once you've got 10, 15, 20 properties in your portfolio, you can then use that cash flow. Let's say that you've got 10 properties that give you 100 bucks a week. 10 properties that give you 100 bucks a week, there's 1,000 bucks a week, there's 50 grand a year. There's an average wage covered for. If inflation hits, well, then rents rise. So you're going to keep seeing your income increase, which is why I keep getting happier and happier on all of my videos, because I've got a really cool asset base. And I think everybody should have an asset base that brings them that cash flow. And I think 10 is a really comfortable sort of number. It is getting harder and harder for people to be able to do that because there's less and less locations that you can do it with. But I've never seen so much opportunity as I have seen in 2020, 2021, 2022. There's lots of opportunity out there. I've seen people literally buy properties and they've doubled in 12 months, 2 years time. I've seen them go up 3 or 4 times in some instances. So as a person, you've got choices. You can either go and buy the house, hook yourself up to $1 million worth of debt, work really hard, spend 30 years to pay for it, or you can just live your life as you are, pay your rent, do whatever you need to do, and then go and buy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 investment properties and then put the tenants in there. These guys pay you rent. Their rent continuously goes up. The property value goes up, and then you can then tap into the equity, of that property, pull out a little bit of equity to go buy yourself your dream home, and then have your tenants pay your mortgage for you. So for me today, like, I look at all my properties that I've got, I look at my principal place, look at all my other ones, and I think to myself, like, I've utilized one asset to get into another, to get into another, to get into another. And the cash flow, like, I don't pay my mortgages, my tenants pay my mortgages. I don't pay my beach house, my tenants pay my beach house. And I think having a very good mindset and understand that it's all just numbers, that gives you clarity to be able to make specific sort of decisions. So looking at buying that house to live in is not necessarily the best thing to do financially. Probably in 80% of the households that I see out there, it's not the smartest decision to do financially, but it gives you a sense of security. I understand it, I get it, but you've got to work out what the outcome is that you're seeking, and what works best for you. Ultimately, you can sit here and say, I can't buy shit, and then you continuously be able to say that year after year. Or you can go out there and say, well, I'm going to buy something that I can afford. I'm going to buy whatever I can afford. So I've got access to the market. If the house that goes up from $1 million to $2 million gets out of my price range, at least I've got a 200 grand property that goes to 400 grand. Now I've got 200 grand worth of equity that I can use as a deposit to get into one of those bigger properties. Or you can just work really hard and keep saving and being on that treadmill. So, work out what is your game plan. What is your strategy? If you are sitting here going, look, should I sell off my house and go buy investment properties or whatever? There are discussions to be had. Are you working out, I can't afford a principal place of residence. Should I buy an investment property first? I actually think that probably 70% of my investors over the years have rentvested, where they've bought rental properties first and they've built up their position, and then they've bought the dream home. And probably 30% come to me with their dream home, and then they go and buy investment properties. But it's much easier to buy and build a property portfolio first because you've got more streams of income. So if you're on 80 grand, I'm just using 80 because I think it's a pretty sort of average income out there in the country at the moment. 80 grand income, that would be $1,600 a week. You're on the hook for that. You have to go and get out of bed, get dressed, put on your makeup, lipstick, hop on the train, brush your teeth, send your kids to childcare, whatever, and then come home and then put your feet up at the end of the night. You're earning that money. You're on the hook for it. If you could go and buy 5 investment properties that rent for the $300 a week, you then have 5 properties, $300 a week rent. If they were 200 grand a piece or 150, you're only outlaying about 750 to $1 million. If you're putting down a couple of deposits, you might only have to put down 50, 100, 150 grand. I've seen people get to 5 properties with 60 grand starting capital. And then you've now got 5 rental incomes of $300 a week, which is $1,500 a week, or $78,000 a year worth of sort of cash flow coming through. If you're on 80 grand, you're getting another 78. You've basically doubled your income, but you've only got a small amount of debt. And when you go back to the bank will like you better because they're like, well, now instead of you being an 80 grand income and you can only service for this type of property, now that we see that you've got a little bit of debt over here, but you're now on $160,000 a year, you can now purchase this type of property. So working backwards and reverse engineering, what are your goals? And then working out the vehicles to get you there is very, very important. That's what I specialize in. That's what my team specializes in. If you need help on that, follow the link below in the description. Make sure to watch the rest of the videos out there. Have a chat with my investor relation managers to speak to them and see what options there are. Have a discovery session, see if it's something that could work for you. Link in the description. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. As always, share it, like it, and subscribe. And we'll catch up next week. Bye for now.
Like Bilal said, man, we're stuck in the matrix. This my advice, don't care if you take it. The dollar back to die, soon to be hyperinflated. This my 2 cents, don't care if you save it. Joint be decentralized and you will see you been lied to the whole time, and it's the irony, cause they do the exact opposite. You become a slave to the system, enough your money, all they do is profit. There's no conspiracy theory, you better hear me. Crypto will set you free before the system does. I don't care if you do or you don't, but what I'm saying is the truth to the reason you choke. I never been a failure, excuse my behavior. Keep talking, haters doing me a favor. They all tell lies, I know what they been telling you. I'm the opposite, the Donald Trump of Australia. It's amazing, here for the taking. My time is never wasted, just getting wasted. These girls say I'm really breathtaking. I can't help it if I really misbehave.